Welcome to this how-to video for the How to Learn Chinese ebook. So in this video I'm going to show you how to get the most out of the ebook and also explain the fundamental principles for language learning so that you can make a great start learning Chinese. So we'll start by going to the table of contents, and immediately you'll notice that it's very detailed. There's a lot of numbers and it's all categorized according to parts, chapters, sub-chapters and sections, and this is so that you can use the guide in whichever way you please, be it as a follow along where you read it cover to cover, or as a reference tool where you dip in and out of it according to whichever sections you're wanting to read about on a given day. And you can use it in whichever way you please. Now, of course, I'd recommend reading it cover to cover, but if, for example, you're not a big fan of reading and stuff, you can use it as more of a reference tool. Now, before we get into each part of the guide, I just want to talk about, in the top left here, you've got how to use this guide, which we're covering now. Why I started How to Learn Languages. Now, you don't have to read that part. That's just in case you're interested in my experience learning languages and how that shaped my approach to learning languages. But you don't have to read that. It's just in case the context will be interesting and useful for you. And then we've just got a small section about defining fluency, and the reason that's not only worth covering in the book but mentioning now is that when people talk about fluency, they sometimes think about being able to speak a language at the level of a first language speaker, but that's not actually what fluency is really. That is proficiency, a level above fluency. Fluency is still obviously being very comfortable with the language. You can understand, if you're fluent, you can understand the vast majority of what you listen to or read, and can speak the language without having to pause for much thought, without much hesitation and so on. But it is still a level below proficiency. If you follow the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, then I guess fluency would probably be in the B2 level, and probably quite high up in the B2 level, which is widely acknowledged to be quite a broad level, B2. And then proficiency would be C1, certainly C2, at the level of the first language speaker. Now, with that all covered, we'll get into the parts of the guide itself. Now, there's 5 key parts to the guide. The first is the overview. Now, whether or not you want to use the guide as a follow-along or just as a reference tool, I'd recommend reading the overview either way, as it will lay a very good foundation for you about the fundamental principles for language learning and also some key points about learning Chinese. Now, the next parts of the guide are Introduction to Chinese, where you'll become familiar with the Chinese language and some of the key features of the language, especially the things which set it apart from English and languages that are more closely related to English. And then we go on to a settling in period. Then you have the path to fluency, where you combine all the elements of language learning to really progress forward with your Chinese. And then what next, which shows you how to keep improving beyond fluency. And then as a last bit, there's some tutorials at the end as a bit of an add-on. Now, before we go into each of these parts in more detail, it's worth in this video covering the fundamental principles for language learning. Not only so that you can get off to a great start learning Chinese, but also so that you can understand the format of this guide in a deeper way, because the guide is structured to incorporate these fundamental principles of language learning in as effective and enjoyable a way as possible. Now, we'll go to, of course you can read about all this in the guide, but for the sake of this video, I'll also talk about the fundamental principles, and these are in 1.1, How to Learn Languages. Now, which of course is in the overview. So, there are 3 key principles for learning languages, and these are passive learning, active learning and practice. Now, passive learning is, as you can sort of tell by the name, it's immersion really. It's very passive, a passive exercise. You don't need to be concentrating on Chinese when you're passively immersing in the language. And this is great news because it means you can accumulate many hours listening to Chinese without it having to impede on your daily schedule. It can become parts of things you already do. For example, your commute to work, cooking, cleaning, doing exercise, just about anything you can think of you do each day, which doesn't require total concentration on your part, where you can have Chinese playing in the background. That will be perfect for passive learning, i.e. immersing in Chinese. Now, a very important thing to mention is that this immersion should be with the language in its most natural form, an undiluted form. In other words, with content that first language speakers would listen to, or Chinese speakers would listen to. And you may be wondering, well, if I can't understand any of it, then why am I doing that? Well, from the moment you start the process, you should be immersing in that stuff precisely because you won't be able to understand it. The sooner you expose your brain to the sounds and sound patterns of Chinese, the sooner you'll become familiar with them. It's as simple as that, really. Now, with that in mind, it's something you should be doing throughout the whole process, from start to finish, in inverted commas, when you reach some sort of level of fluency and beyond. And one more thing to mention is the idea of comprehensible input. Now, comprehensible input isn't something I consider when I'm learning languages, but it's become very popular on YouTube, so it's worth clarifying here. So comprehensible input is basically the idea that you use resources and materials where you can understand, the majority of that material, be it 70, 80, even 90% of it. And the logic behind it is that if you can understand, the majority of it, the part of it that you can't understand will be easier to, infer the meaning, figure out the meaning because of the context of the majority of it that you do understand. Now, as a concept, there's nothing wrong with that. It makes sense. It's not incorrect. However, I don't really think it's helpful when, thinking about language learning. And that's because, the term comprehensible input, the word input leads people to think that, their immersion should be with materials where they can understand at least a fair amount of it, and that's not what immersion is for at all. Immersion is for getting you used to the language in its undiluted, natural form as fast as possible. So you want to be using materials that Chinese speakers would listen to. Now, comprehensible input can be useful in terms of with active learning, and we'll cover that shortly, but just remember, with passive learning, keep that separate and just immerse in content, materials that Chinese speakers would use. Now, for active learning, that is essentially just learning new phrases. So I call this sentence collecting. You'll have seen it called other names probably, such as chunking or sentence mining. There's various names for it, but they all boil down to the same thing, which is learning new phrases. Now, it's very important to learn the new phrases as a whole instead of learning individual words. It's more fun, more effective, and when you focus on learning whole phrases, you not only learn all the words in that phrase, you also learn the grammar of that phrase, automatically, that is, because each phrase contains grammar. So you'll naturally be building up your understanding of Chinese grammar, and as I said, more than one word, because you'll be getting, at least several words in a phrase, if not more, if it's a longer sentence. So it's a much more effective and fun way to learn. And also, by learning phrases and sentences, because they have their own context based on the meaning of that phrase or sentence, you'll already have some sort of sense of how you could use that in conversation when you're practicing with Chinese speakers. Now, sentence collecting can be done in a very basic way, where you just, for example, go to YouTube, to a video with, lists of phrases and note them down, and, practice saying them aloud, and then eventually practicing them with Chinese speakers in conversation. And that's absolutely fine. If you enjoy that, you can just do it like that. However, if you want to make it a little bit more engaging, a little bit more interesting, you can use what I call active listening and reading, which is basically where you follow active learning, i.e. sentence collecting, learning new phrases, but through using materials, content and resources that either Chinese speakers would use, as in first language speakers, or materials and resources that have been put together in an interesting way for people learning Chinese. And both of those are very helpful. They could be just about anything you're interested in, really. There aren't any set rules you need to follow for which materials you use for active learning. All you need to bear in mind is that you're using materials you enjoy using, in terms of the medium they're on, about topics you're interested in or that feel relevant to your life, and of course that enable you to learn new phrases or learn new sentences. Now, you can do that in a very literal way, where you, for example, note them down or keep a spreadsheet of the new phrases or flashcards, etc. That's absolutely fine, and it is effective, so by all means go ahead and do that if you'd like. But also, don't be afraid to do it in a bit more of a subliminal way, where, for example, you actively learn with some material, some content, for example by writing out the transcript or typing out the transcript of a Chinese speaker's vlog about daily life in China, for instance. The act of typing it out and sort of taking it in as you're doing that, you'll subliminally be, learning about these new phrases and sentences anyway, without having to specifically, make a list of new phrases you've picked up from that exercise, for example. But it's up to you. Either way is okay. It can be very effective to note them down sort of separately as well, but just see how you're finding it and do whatever you enjoy more. As long as you're collecting sentences, collecting phrases, be it literally or subliminally, that's grand. Now, in terms of how to remember what you learn, there's various memory techniques you can use, and we'll touch on these shortly. But alongside this, think of the memory techniques as supplements, but the core way to remember what you learn is the final key element of language learning, which is practice with first language speakers. Now, the reason this is so effective for remembering what you learn during active learning is that using something is the most effective way to remember it, especially with language learning. And practice with Chinese speakers is the most natural, authentic way that you can use the phrases you've been learning during active learning. So it's very effective. Now, the other reasons that practice is such an essential element of language learning, fairly self-explanatory, I guess. By practicing with Chinese speakers, you'll get better at having conversations with Chinese speakers, of course. But also, when people often obsess a little bit about being fluent in inverted commas or reaching fluency. That word fluency, the part of the process which brings you on most with that specifically is practice with Chinese speakers. For example, if you have, say, 50, just as an arbitrary figure, 50 conversations with different people over the first, say, couple of months of learning Chinese, in each of those conversations, especially the start of those conversations, you are going to repeat a lot of phrases about, greeting, asking how people are, how their day's been, how their work's going, that sort of thing. And in that process, you will get very familiar with responding to questions related to that sort of thing. So after a certain point, it will become just automatic. And that'll, you'll notice that, when you have conversations in real life and are asked a question you've been asked plenty of times before during your practice, and you just respond automatically without having to think, and that's fluency. And it gets forged primarily during your practice. Now, of course, other aspects of fluency, such as, understanding the language fluently, that comes through immersion and so on. But, yeah, practice is very important. Now, I'd recommend practicing with Chinese speakers as soon as you can, after starting the path to fluency. But if, for example, you're feeling a bit shy and want to build up a bit of confidence first, then what you can do is think of scenarios in your head and practice responding to them in Chinese just by yourself. Not ideal, but if it will help you build up a bit of confidence, then you can always try that. Now, to go back to the table of contents, we'll now work our way through the different parts of the guide. So with Introduction to Chinese, I'd certainly recommend reading all of this, whether, apart from the history part, whether you want to, use this guide as a follow along or a reference tool. And that's because, Chinese has so many features that are different to English, but, it's very important to become familiar with those before you embark on the process of learning the language. So for example, with other how to learn languages guides, I say, if you're wanting to use it as a reference tool, then only certain parts of the introduction are really necessary to read. But with like Chinese, Vietnamese, where they've got some features that are very different to English, I'd recommend reading just about all of it, apart from, the history section here. So yeah, we start by defining Chinese. Now, just briefly to touch on that here, you'll notice I'm referring to it as Chinese, but it's much more nuanced than that. Like, the language you're going to be learning through this guide is Mandarin Chinese, and in defining Chinese you'll learn a lot more about that, where the term comes from, the debate between languages, dialects, topolects, in terms of terminology, all sorts of things like that. So I definitely recommend reading that. Why learn Chinese? You only really need to read that. I've included that for times when, later in the process, there will be days where your motivation just doesn't feel quite right, not like it normally would, and, you could always read the why learn Chinese part to try and rekindle a bit of that fire to help you keep pushing forward. Now, in terms of the rest of the introduction, I won't go into too much detail for this video because it would make the video even longer than it will already be, and I know everyone's very busy and stuff, so but basically we'll cover Pinyin, the essential things you need to know about Pinyin, which is the official romanized system for writing Chinese and typing Chinese, to select characters then to type or to message with. So yeah, we'll cover Pinyin, how to go about learning Pinyin, links to useful resources for learning Pinyin. Same with tones, another essential part of Chinese. And just quickly on tones, I'd recommend, well, first of all, don't be too daunted by them. They are quite challenging, especially if it's the first time you learn a tonal language. And again, you will make plenty of mistakes in inverted commas with tones. Again, that's nothing to worry about. It's a very natural part of the process. I've seen, videos where people with doctorates who've been learning Chinese for years say they're still trying to sharpen up aspects of their tones in Chinese, so don't worry about making mistakes with tones. It will happen and it's a part of the process, and you will gradually get better at them, don't worry. And so with that in mind, in this section, you'll learn about the fundamental things you need to know about tones, how to learn tones, resources for learning tones, but also one word of advice for right now I'd say is, when you get to that section, do be sure to spend at least a bit of time really focusing on tones before you get started with the rest of the process, because it will just make the rest of the process a lot smoother for you, a lot less stressful, and yeah, it will really pay off later in the process. There are plenty of cases you hear about online, where people say, they didn't focus on tones and then they found, months, even years into the process that actually their spoken Chinese was a bit of a mess. So yeah, that's not to scare you, that's just to say it's worth giving yourself as thorough a grounding in tones as you can at the start. Making mistakes with them is perfectly fine, but just try to be as thorough with it as you can at the start, and then just the rest of the process will help you naturally improve. Well, the rest of the process outlined in this guide anyway. And then we move on to Chinese characters, all the essential things you need to know about them, and also, simplified, traditional, which one you should focus on based on your goals, etc., and whether you can learn both, or how to learn both, or which one to focus on first. Now we then have the head start, which just talks about, the logic of certain Chinese words. There is very little common vocabulary with English. However, when you break down certain Chinese words into their component parts, there's a lot of logic to them, and this can help you remember them. And then after that we've got the history of Chinese. Now this isn't essential to read, but I would recommend reading it because it will make the whole process of learning Chinese more enriching, because you'll have a deeper understanding of the language and the things you're coming across during the learning process. Now if You do want to read it, but you're itching to get into the rest of the process, then what you could do is read on with the rest of the process and then come back to read the history part. Now, after the introduction to Chinese, we move on to the settling in period. Now, this is a period of anywhere between a few days to a few weeks where you just immerse in Chinese, get used to the tools that are available for learning Chinese, such as how to type in Chinese, showing Pinyin when you're on the browser and stuff to help you with reading Chinese during the early stages, how to use Pleco, which is the best dictionary for Chinese, and things like that. And also another key part of the settling in period is learning how to learn Chinese characters. Now, you probably will come across advice online and stuff where people say, oh, you can just ignore characters if you're just wanting to speak and stuff. I wouldn't recommend doing that personally, and I personally think the sooner you start trying to learn characters the better, because it does take time. But I'll show you in this section how to go about learning them in as hopefully pain-free a way as possible. And once you complete the process outlined there, you'll be delighted that you did, because it will make the rest of the process learning Chinese much more rewarding and less stressful, because you'll have a much more solid understanding of the characters you're constantly coming across. Now, I won't go into more detail here because there's lots in the book for you to read through, but I give you different options for learning Chinese characters, even though I would recommend using Remembering the Hanzi, a great 2-volume textbook for learning Chinese characters in as quick a way as possible, but there are other alternatives you can use, and we cover these as well. Now, in terms of how you put all that together, for the settling in period of a few days to a few weeks, what I'd recommend doing is basically reading the How to Learn Chinese Characters section and setting yourself up with a routine for learning characters. That doesn't at all mean that you need to complete the process of learning characters in inverted commas. Like, just as an example, you don't need to complete the Remembering the Hanzi textbooks before then moving on with the rest of the process, not at all. Just make sure before you finish the settling in period, you've set up a routine for learning characters based on what you've learned in that section, and chosen, a resource or resources you like for doing that, and that have been recommended. And also make sure you're immersing in Chinese for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, however long you prefer to spend on the settling in period. Now, I explain how to do that in listening to Chinese, reading Chinese, and then creating a routine shows you how you could put all that together for a routine for the settling in period. Fortunately, with Immersion, as we've mentioned, because it's passive, you can attach it to things you already do, so it's not difficult to accumulate hours and hours of listening to Chinese over a period of time. And you've got here resources for Immersion where you can choose any resources you'd like: podcasts and radio, music, audiobooks, books, series and film, YouTube, news and articles, Chinese apps and social media, to get started immersing in the language. Now, we'll just take a very quick look at that. We go to YouTube. We've obviously got channels for learning Chinese, which can have some good immersion stuff, but especially good for active learning. And then, news, current affairs, economics, vlogs, travel, cooking, health, lifestyle, books, history, series and films, science and tech. Channels based in Taiwan if you're wanting to focus on Chinese spoken in Taiwan. And also some interesting channels in English, just to add some context to what you might be learning about when immersing in Chinese, to help make it a bit more familiar. Now, we'll go back to the table of contents. So as I say, the settling in period, anywhere between a few days to a few weeks. I'd recommend a few weeks if you can, but if you're itching to crack on with the rest of the process, that's fine. After a few days, move on to the path to fluency here. Now, in the path to fluency, that's basically when you continue your immersion, continue learning Chinese characters, but also add active learning and practice. So that's when you combine all three fundamental elements for language learning: passive, active and practice, and that will really propel you forward with your Chinese. Now, those three fundamental things complement each other. You'll notice stuff during immersion that you'd been learning in active learning, and vice versa, and same with your practice. So they really complement each other well. Now, for the path to fluency, I start by talking about passive learning in more detail so that you can get even more out of it during the process, with tips and techniques like changing the language of your devices or phone to Chinese, stuff like that. Then we go into detail on active learning. Now if you want to just use it as a reference tool, don't worry, the overview of active learning gives you the essential bullet points you need to know about active learning. We then cover sentence collecting in more detail, including the free resources and paid resources you can use. The difference is usually not quality but time. Paid resources are often organised in a way that makes them more convenient to use because you just have to use them as such. Whereas sometimes with free resources you have to arrange them yourself, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they're also very convenient to use and obviously more affordable. Now, sentence creating is just when you're collecting sentences, collecting phrases, be sure to try swapping out words and replacing them with other words to make new sentences, as this is a very effective way to improve your Chinese, build your confidence, and also just expand, the amount of phrases you have in general. Now, the only caveat is to, when you're practicing with Chinese speakers, try out the sentences you've created, because not all of them will be sentences people would actually use. So yeah, it's important to get feedback on it, but don't worry about making mistakes, in inverted commas. They're not mistakes, they're an essential, that sort of making mistakes is an essential part of the process. So don't even think of it as mistakes. And you'll also make sentences that people would use, so don't worry. Now, active listening and reading, we cover the theory behind that, but also all the resources and mediums you can use to do that if you want to make sentence collecting a bit more engaging and interesting. And then in how to remember what you learn, we've got different memory techniques, including SRS, spaced repetition systems, like Anki, which you may well be familiar with. And, another one for Chinese, similar, is like Hack Chinese, you may have heard of. These are all great. They do have their drawbacks. So if you don't enjoy them, you don't need to use them. Only use them if you enjoy them, then they are worth using. I personally like to use, like a notebook, but you can use a diary, voice memos. Chorusing is a great memory technique, but also really helps improve your pronunciation. And just again, with SRS actually and flashcards, with Chinese, and you'll read about this in the How to Learn Chinese Characters part, I would recommend using Anki or, spaced repetition systems when you're learning characters specifically, because you'll be coming across several thousand of them at least, and it can just really help with that process. But apart from that, flashcards aren't essential for remembering what you cover in active learning, the phrases you collect. Now then we've got practice, just talking about different forms of practice and the apps you can use like Tandem and HelloTalk to chat with Chinese speakers. And of course, if you're in an expat area or living in China or a Chinese-speaking region, then hopefully you might be able to practice in person as well, to practice even more. And then putting it all together is just about putting together your routine, which incorporates immersion, active learning and practice. Won't go into much more detail in this video for that, but basically just be sure to be flexible, because our lives, our schedules change on a monthly, weekly, even daily basis. And so our plans for learning a language also have to be flexible. So even though it can be frustrating, especially when you're in a really good rhythm, try not to be too disheartened when you inevitably do have to alter your plans a little and adjust them. So just be flexible. Then what next is about how to keep improving. Basically, it is just a case of continuing to immerse and practice. You won't need to do much active learning by that point, if at all. And then we cover HSK, because I know a lot of people want to get their Chinese level certified for different reasons. A little bit of information on classical and literary Chinese, which is also covered in the history section, but this is more about, resources for learning about that. Got some tutorials here, adding audio to flashcards should you wish to use flashcards, overcoming challenges, how to learn 2 languages at once, just, the former for when, you're struggling for motivation or having to take a break from the language, and then how to learn 2 languages at once, as it says. Now, if you see any images in this guide which you think, that looks like an interesting place, you might want to visit there in the future if you get the opportunity, you can find out where it is here in the images part, and also you'll be able to see, who took the photo, from Unsplash. Now, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Give me an email at contact@howtolearnlanguages.info, and I'll get back to you promptly. So yeah, if that's any time you've got a question, I'll be happy to help. And if you enjoyed the guide, please feel free to leave a review on the reviews page of the website or email me, and I'll be delighted to hear your feedback. So I think that just about covers everything for this video, and yeah, I hope you enjoy learning Chinese.